So as discussed, bread wheat, Triticum aestivum, and the Latin name refers to tritirare, which means to grind, because the seeds, or really little fruits, kernels are actually fruits of wheat, have to be ground to produce the flour that we use to make the bread. So this particular species in the wild, so was not a human hybridization. So in the wild it hybridized. So the production of this particular species, bread wheat, has happened naturally. And what happened was an initial hybridization happened in between this old type of wheat that has only 14 chromosomes, together with a different grass, a different even genus than Triticum, so Aegilops, a wild goat grass. And first, they produced a hybrid with the same number of chromosomes, but in order for those chromosomes to line up at metaphase plate, it was much easier to become a tetraploid. So that's how we get the emmer wheat, or Triticum turgidum, which is a tetraploid. The separate encounter, this particular tetraploid has hybridized once again with a type of wild grass in the genus Aegilops that also happens to have 14 chromosomes, and that's how we have Triticum aestivum that we love and enjoy every day, every time we have bread. And I hope you notice this matchstick here to see the sizes of this type of grasses and grains and their spikes. So you can notice right away that this hexaploid that we call Triticum aestivum, it's much larger, both the spike and the kernels. So right here you can see the kernels are much larger, probably more nutritious, and together with barley, probably barley was first, but we know that wheat played a major role in human civilization because of agriculture. That led to division of labor and society, cities and societies as we know it today. And it's still one of the major crops, probably in top 3. Finding top 1 with corn and rice, and more recently also sugarcane. That probably is the biggest production in in mass today. But sympatric speciation does not require, or it can happen in the absence of increased number of sets of chromosomes that happen in one generation through hybridization, or even for just doubling of its own sets of chromosomes. That will prevent the diploids to produce fertile offsprings when they breed with the tetraploids. So it can happen in the same locale, because that's the definition of a sympatric speciation, without a change in chromosome number. And a great example for that takes us to Lake Victoria in Africa, where, so first of all, this lake, which is probably about 400 million years old, or 400,000, we know that this lake has dried up several times in its history. And the most recent one was only 12,400 years ago. So since the last repopulation of this lake with fish and all the other organisms in this lake, there are more than 500 species of cichlid or cyclid fish, type of fish that you'll see a picture in a second, that populate the shallow waters of this lake. And so again, they were probably from the same species, but they speciated in this particular lake. But first, let's take a quick geography tour or geography trip. We're going to Africa, and right here to Lake Victoria, which is in between Uganda and Tanzania, and it's bordering Kenya. And this lake is also the origin of the River Nile, the biggest river in Africa. Speaking about the biggest, Lake Victoria, it's also the biggest body of fresh water in Africa. It's second in surface size, only to Lake Superior in North America for inland bodies of fresh water. And it provides a diversity of microecosystems, which allows for this radiation of diverse species of fish. So what happens in the shallow waters of Lake Victoria, there could be different levels of water column. And the deeper the water column, you will get a different type of wavelengths of visible light that make it deeper. So in shallow waters, female fish can see bluer fish, so on the blue side of the spectrum, which have higher energy, but they also have lower, shorter wavelengths. While on the deeper waters, but still relatively shallow water, so not very deep in Lake Victoria, female fish have adapted or have the ability to see better the red males, because even though, so on the red side of the spectrum, so even though red has lower energy than blue and purple, red has longer wavelengths. So if we are putting this fish of different species, male and female, in an aquarium, and they can see each other, then they could meet, they could breed across a diversity of species. But in real life, there is reproductive isolation that does not allow female fish to see the male fish unless they adapted to the same level of column of water. Now, speak about extremely interesting type of specific of sympatric speciation. We'll take a tour of Asia in the Tibetan Plateau to meet these green warblers, which are a type of bird, Philoscopus trochiloides, which is also called, so this particular species is called a ring species. And it's called a ring species because we believe it originated somewhere in the Himalayas. And then it migrated both east and west. In order to see that hypothesis, please click on the link on this ring species. It's a link to University of British Columbia, Canada, that has a very interesting article, a very detailed article with maps and theories going back to 1938 about how this particular Philoscopus trochiloides or green warblers have evolved. And take your time to read that article. Click on the links to see the behavioral mechanisms of, so the songs, you can actually listen to the songs of different species that do not recognize each other. So it's behavioral isolation that prevents prezygotic, that leads to prezygotic reproductive barriers within the same locale or sympatric speciation. So you'll see the picture in a moment. Even though genetic flow or gene flow can happen across the ring, so within small populations from one part to the other, gene flow happens. But it doesn't happen all the way because we're talking about small birds that cannot fly that much, or they don't need to fly that much. They're not necessarily a migratory type of bird. So even though very close populations can keep breeding, and you'll see the color changes from red to orange to green and eventually to blue. Once they meet again on the top of this really large areal around the Tibetan Plateau in Central Asia, the two species, even though encountered, they are found in the same areal, they don't recognize each other. and it's because of the song, so it's a behavioral. They do have slight morphological differences that they can also pick on, but it's more of the song, so behavioral isolation. So, and again, the two populations that overlap, when they overlap, they can recognize, but you will see slight differences. And you will notice when you click on those links to listen to their songs that probably human ear is not acute enough to notice the differences, but birds trying to breed probably will and do. So these are the green warblers that we're talking about. Philoscopus trochiloides, and this is the map that I was talking about. So it is believed that actually the species originated somewhere here in the mountains, in between India and Nepal and Bhutan and so on. So, and it migrated both west and east, and it went up north, and it met again. Okay, and here where it meets, we're going to find out that it looks more like Parapatric speciation. But let's stick with this for a moment. What happens is, again, warblers in this area can meet and breed, and you can see they're the same species, and they meet and breed. But once they get here, they maybe don't meet as much, and they keep on transitioning from, as I said, blue to green to yellow and red and orange. And historically, the species was a real ring species, so it went on. So here was continuing. Unfortunately, because of human population and natural habitats displacement, it's not found in that particular area where it interrupted, which would lead to further speciation, in this case, through geographical barrier. So this picture shows you speciation through all types of species that we talked about. So if this geographical barrier continues, we're talking here about allopatric speciation, in between species that are very close to each other, so populations that are here in the blue and populations here in the green, and the green with the yellow and the yellow with the orange, those are very overlapping in space, so that's sympatric speciation. But then when they meet again, after many, many generations later, in the area that is overlapping blue with red, so now it looks more or less violet or purple, that will be more like parapatric speciation. And we didn't talk about that yet, so let's move on to that. So parapatric, the word stands from parallel. So the two locales are parallel to each other, and actually they're quite adjacent. And even though the two species are separated and they cannot produce viable, fertile offsprings, they can hybridize, they can breed, and as I said, they don't produce viable, fertile offspring, so they remain separate species. One interesting example comes to us from all the way in Tasmania. So I don't have a picture for that included in this presentation, but I want you to take a moment and just think, where would Tasmania be? And then maybe even look it up, and you'll find out that is on the eastern south part. So it's south of Australia, on the eastern side of Australia. So it's a pretty large island. And on the eastern side of this island of Tasmania, you can find these two very interesting velvet walking worms. And even though they look incredibly cute and soft, and probably they are very soft since they're called velvet worms, they're actually voracious predators. And they are more related, so even though they look more or less like caterpillars, they're more related to spiders. And they hunt very similar to spiders by sending something similar to a spider web, but it's a glue with which they trap their prey. So two species, the giant velvet walking worm, or Tasmipatus barrettii, or barretti, and then the blind velvet walking worm, and the Greek word anophthalmos stands for that, without eyes, so blind. So the two of them have a distribution that overlaps, and at the overlapping area they can hybridize, but they don't produce any viable fertile offsprings, and that's how the species remain separate. So they're probably related species, or they were part of the same species originally, since they are still able to hybridize, and they recognize each other to do so. But right now, they are a completely different species, Tasmipatus barretti and Tasmipatus anophthalmus. Quick review of the modes of speciations we just learned. So they all start with the same one population that can share full interbreeding across the board. Allopatric, as the word very clearly tells you, it refers to separation in two geographical areas by some kind of physical barrier that could be natural or artificial. In Parapatric, the separation, it's more complicated to understand, and it's probably happening this way. If you have a large enough population of a relatively small species like the velvet walking worms in Tasmania, or even the ring species of green warblers, some of the individuals that are on this edge of the habitat don't have the opportunity to meet with the individuals of this edge of the habitat. So eventually, mutations, natural selection, and genetic drift can lead the two ends of this population to speciate. And they continue to overlap in the middle, and there is a hybrid zone. In the sympatric speciation, it has to be some kind of a change that allows a small subset of the population within the same RL, within the area where they can meet and hybridize and recognize each other. But there is a genetic barrier that does not allow them to successfully do so. And as we discussed, the most easy way to happen, or the most easy to understand way to happen, it's within one generation, the number of sets of chromosomes changes. So becoming a tetraploid, for example, and then you have a diploid subset of this species and a tetraploid subset of this species. Or because of adaptations to different microenvironments that allow female fish in Lake Victoria to recognize only the type of male fish that they can see better where they adapted to, and so on. That's it for now.